My name is Robert Hale, and for most of my life, the house next door belonged to people I called family. Not by blood exactly, but by the kind of proximity that, over enough decades, starts to feel like blood anyway. My wife Diane and I bought our house on Larkspur Avenue 31 years ago, and the Coopers had already been living next door for nearly a decade by then. Frank Cooper was my late father's cousin, which made him something like an uncle to me, close enough in relation and closer still in daily life, given that our two properties shared a single low fence and, for most of my childhood memories, a single unbroken stream of visiting back and forth. I want to explain this relationship carefully because I think it matters to understanding how difficult the events of this story became, how much harder it is to see danger clearly when it's wearing a face you've trusted your entire life. Frank had a son, Curtis, who grew up 2 years ahead of me, close enough in age that we spent our childhoods essentially as siblings, riding bikes down the same cracked sidewalk, building the same disastrous treehouse that collapsed twice before our fathers finally gave up trying to reinforce it. Curtis was, for most of that childhood, someone I trusted without a second thought, the kind of near family you don't examine too closely, because examining it has never once occurred to you as necessary. Diane and I had our daughter, Megan, relatively late in our marriage, when I was 38 and Diane was 36, after years of trying that had worn both of us down in ways I still don't fully talk about. Megan grew up, in some sense, under the watchful, extended umbrella of the Cooper family next door, Frank, and his wife Ruth doting on her the way grandparents might. Curtis, by then well into his 30s, treating her with the easy, distant kindness of a much older cousin. I remember, in particular, a summer when Megan was perhaps 8 years old, when Curtis spent nearly every weekend teaching her to fish at the small pond 2 streets over, patiently untangling her line every time she cast it into a nearby tree, never once showing the kind of impatience I might have expected from a grown man spending his Saturdays entertaining an 8-year-old. I remember thinking, at the time, how lucky Megan was to have that kind of extended family, an uncle figure willing to invest real time and real patience in her, when so many children grow up without any such presence at all. I have thought about that summer many times in the years since, turning it over uncomfortably in my memory, searching for anything in those long, patient afternoons that might have hinted at what was still, at that time, more than a decade away from happening. I have never found anything. I do not believe, even now, that Curtis's behavior toward Megan as a child was anything other than genuine, uncomplicated affection. Whatever changed in him, I believe it changed later, gradually, in ways none of us were positioned to notice, until it was already well underway. I am telling you all of this so that you understand what it means when I say that, when this story truly begins, when the events I am about to describe first started, I did not see them coming. I could not have imagined that the man who had once taught my daughter to ride a bike in our shared driveway, who had spent entire summer weekends untangling her fishing line with the patience of a saint, would become the source of the most difficult conflict our family has ever navigated. Megan turned 20 in the spring of a year I will simply call 2 years ago, because the exact date matters less than what began happening around it. She had recently finished her associate's degree and moved back home while she figured out her next steps, working part-time at a bookstore downtown and taking a few additional courses at the community college. It was, by every measure, an ordinary, unremarkable stretch of her early adulthood, the kind of transitional period most young people pass through without incident. It was Diane who noticed the change first, the way mothers often notice things fathers are too distracted or too trusting to catch. She mentioned it to me one evening, almost in passing, while we were doing dishes together after dinner. "Have you noticed Curtis has been over here a lot more?" she asked, not looking up from the plate she was scrubbing. I had noticed, vaguely, but hadn't thought much of it. Curtis had always come and gone between our two properties with the easy familiarity of someone who had grown up doing exactly that. "He's probably just bored," I said. "Ruth mentioned his marriage isn't doing so well. Maybe he needs the company." "He's not coming over to see you and me," Diane said. "He's coming over when Megan is home, every time." I remember dismissing this at first, not because I doubted Diane's instincts. She has always been more perceptive than I am about the undercurrents in a room, but because the alternative explanation felt genuinely unthinkable to me. Curtis was family. He had known Megan since she was born. The idea that his sudden increased presence in our home might have anything to do with anything other than simple loneliness felt like a betrayal of a relationship I had never once had reason to question. But Diane kept watching, and over the following weeks, she began to notice a pattern that was harder to explain away. Curtis had started finding reasons to be at our house whenever Megan's work schedule brought her home in the early afternoon. He would linger in the kitchen when she made herself lunch. He began commenting on her appearance in ways that made Diane's stomach turn, she told me later, nothing overtly inappropriate, nothing that could be pointed to directly as evidence of anything, but a persistent, low-grade attentiveness that felt wrong in a way neither of us could yet articulate. Diane started keeping a mental log, she admitted to me later, of the small things, the way Curtis's visits had shifted from occurring every couple of weeks to nearly every few days, the way his conversation, once evenly split between Diane, myself, and Megan, had gradually narrowed until it was almost entirely directed at Megan alone, even when she was clearly occupied with something else, even when her responses were brief and distracted. Diane mentioned, once, that she had watched Curtis position himself at the kitchen table so that his chair faced directly toward wherever Megan happened to be standing, a small physical detail that meant nothing on its own, but that, accumulated alongside a dozen similar small details, began to paint a picture Diane found increasingly difficult to ignore. "I keep telling myself I'm imagining it," she confessed to me one night, weeks before Megan finally said anything herself. "He's known her since she was born. It feels insane to even consider what I'm considering. But something in my gut won't let it go, Robert. Mothers notice things. I don't know how to explain it better than that. I wish, now, that I had taken Diane's instincts more seriously in that moment, rather than gently talking her down from what I then considered an overreaction. I have had to sit with that regret in the time since the recognition that my own comfort with an old, trusted relationship very nearly delayed us from protecting our daughter as quickly as we should have. There was one specific evening, in particular, that Diane has described to me many times since as the moment her uncertainty first hardened into something closer to genuine alarm. She had come downstairs late one night for a glass of water and found Curtis's truck still parked in our driveway well past 10 o'clock, long after Diane and I had assumed he'd left hours earlier following a casual dinner visit. She found him sitting on our back porch with Megan, the two of them talking quietly in the dark, and while nothing about the scene itself was overtly alarming, they were sitting a reasonable distance apart. The conversation seemed ordinary enough. When Diane asked what they were discussing, something about the sheer duration of it, the lateness of the hour, the fact that Curtis had apparently lingered for hours after the rest of the visit had naturally concluded, struck Diane as deeply wrong in a way she struggled to articulate even to herself. "I asked Megan about it the next morning," Diane told me. "She said he'd just wanted to talk about his divorce, that he seemed lonely, and she felt bad cutting the conversation short, and that answer made sense on its surface. But I remember standing in the kitchen that morning thinking, why does a lonely middle-aged man choose to unburden himself to a 20-year-old rather than any of his actual friends, his siblings, anyone closer to his own age and life stage? It didn't add up, even though I couldn't yet say exactly what it added up to instead. The first time Megan said anything to us directly, it came out sideways, almost accidentally, the way difficult truths often do in families that aren't used to naming difficult things out loud. We were having dinner, the three of us, on a Tuesday evening in early June. Megan had been unusually quiet through most of the meal, pushing food around her plate more than eating it, and when Diane finally asked if something was wrong, Megan set down her fork and said, in a voice that was trying very hard to sound casual, "Can Uncle Curtis just, not come over as much?" "It's kind of weird." "Weird how?" I asked, and I remember the particular tightness that came into my chest even before she answered, some instinct arriving a half-second ahead of understanding. He keeps finding reasons to be around when I'm home," Megan said, still not quite meeting our eyes. "He compliments me in this way that feels off, not normal uncle compliments. He asked me last week if I had a boyfriend, and when I said no, he said something like, 'Good, you deserve someone who really appreciates you, not some kid your own age who doesn't know what he has.' It just felt, I don't know, off." She went on once she realized we were actually listening rather than dismissing her concern outright, to describe several other moments that had accumulated over the preceding weeks, small things individually, the kind of comments that might be explained away one at a time, but that, strung together, formed a pattern that had clearly been weighing on her far more than she'd let on until that dinner. He had started asking pointed questions about her dating life, questions that went beyond ordinary family curiosity into something more probing. He had once told her, while helping carry groceries into the house, that she had grown into someone special, in a tone that made the compliment feel less like praise and more like an observation he had been quietly making for some time. He had begun finding excuses to extend ordinary conversations well past their natural end, lingering in doorways, seeming reluctant to leave whenever she was the one he'd been talking to. I want to be honest about my own reaction in that moment, because I think it's important, even though it isn't flattering. My first instinct was not alarm. My first instinct was a kind of defensive discomfort, an urge to find an innocent explanation that would let me avoid confronting something about a man I had known my entire life. "He's probably just being awkward," I said. "You know, Curtis, he's never been great with normal conversation. His marriage is falling apart. He's probably just looking for any kind of connection right now." Diane gave me a look across the table that I understood, even then, was a warning not against Curtis exactly, but against my own instinct to explain away something my daughter had just told me troubled her. "Dad," Megan said, and there was an edge in her voice I hadn't heard from her before. "I'm telling you it feels wrong. I'm not asking you to fix it, I'm just asking if he can stop coming over so much." I agreed, in that moment, mostly to end the conversation, telling myself I would find a tactful way to mention it to Curtis, some casual comment about giving Megan more space, now that she was busy with school and work. I did not, in that moment, fully register what my daughter was actually telling me, that a man twice her age, a man she had grown up calling uncle, had begun making comments that felt sexual in their undertone, comments dressed up as concern or kindness, but carrying something else beneath them. It would take several more weeks, and one significantly worse incident, before I stopped finding excuses and started actually seeing what was happening in front of me. The incident that changed everything happened on a Thursday afternoon in late July, though I did not learn the full details until that evening, when Megan came home from her shift at the bookstore, visibly shaken, her hands trembling as she set her bag down on the kitchen counter. She had been closing up alone, a task she'd done dozens of times before without incident, when Curtis had shown up at the store nearly 20 minutes after closing, letting himself in through the door she hadn't yet locked, saying he'd been in the neighborhood and wanted to see how she was doing. Megan told us that her first reaction when she saw him come through the door was simple mild annoyance rather than fear, an unwelcome interruption to a closing routine she wanted to finish quickly so she could get home. It did not occur to her, in those first moments, to feel unsafe, because Curtis was still, in her mind, someone she had known and generally trusted for her entire life, even accounting for the discomfort of his recent comments. She told him, politely but firmly, that the store was closed and she needed to finish locking up, hoping he would take the hint and leave. He did not take the hint. Instead, he wandered further into the store, commenting on how quiet it was, how he'd always liked the smell of the place, working his way gradually toward the back of the store, where Megan was finishing her closing tasks in the stockroom. What happened next, Megan told us in halting, careful sentences that evening, was that Curtis had followed her into the back stockroom while she was finishing her closing tasks, positioning himself between her and the door in a way that felt, she said, deliberately intimidating even before he said anything. He told her he'd been thinking about her a lot. He told her that what she needed was someone older, someone who actually understood a woman like her, and when she tried to step past him toward the door, he had put a hand on her arm, not violently, she was careful to specify, but firmly enough that it took a real, physical effort on her part to pull free. Megan described the moment with a precision that suggested she had already replayed it in her mind many times, before telling us the specific way his hand had closed around her forearm, the specific angle of his body blocking the narrow aisle between the shelving units, the specific tone of his voice, which, she said, had shifted from something almost pleading to something that frightened her more, an undertone of frustration when she pulled away that made her suddenly, viscerally aware of how alone she was in that building, how far the nearest occupied storefront was, how long it might take anyone to hear her if she needed to call for help. She told him, in that moment, as clearly and firmly as she could manage with her heart hammering in her chest, that he needed to leave, that whatever he was doing was completely inappropriate, that she considered him family, and this was making that impossible. She told us that Curtis had looked genuinely startled by her firmness, as though he had expected a different reaction entirely, and had backed away, apologizing in a way that somehow still managed to sound more annoyed than genuinely remorseful, muttering something about how she was reading too much into it, before finally leaving. Megan had locked the door behind him, sat down on the stockroom floor, and cried for several minutes before she felt steady enough to finish closing and drive home. She told us that the drive itself had felt strange and disconnected, as though she were watching herself perform the ordinary motions of driving from somewhere just outside her own body, checking her rearview mirror obsessively the entire way, uncertain whether she was watching for Curtis specifically or simply reacting to a fear that had, in the space of 10 minutes, attached itself to everything around her. I do not have adequate words for what I felt listening to my daughter describe this. I remember a physical sensation, a kind of roaring heat that started in my chest and moved up into my ears, drowning out, briefly, my ability to think clearly at all. Diane was crying before Megan even finished the story, and I remember, with a shame that has not entirely faded even now, that some small, stubborn part of me was still searching for an explanation that would let this be a misunderstanding rather than what it so clearly was. That part of me did not survive the rest of the conversation. "Has this happened before?" I asked Megan, once she had calmed down enough to answer more questions. The comments, the "has he ever touched you before tonight?" Megan was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence I understood, with a sinking certainty, that the answer was going to be worse than I had allowed myself to imagine. "A few times," she admitted finally. "Nothing like tonight. But he finds reasons to touch my shoulder, or my back, when he's saying goodbye. It always lasts a second too long. And a few weeks ago, when I was leaving for work, he was in our driveway, and he told me my work uniform shouldn't be allowed to look that good on someone. And I laughed it off, because I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to make it a whole thing. He's family, Dad. Or he's supposed to be." I want to pause here and say something directly to anyone listening to this story who has ever found themselves in the position I was in that night, discovering that a person you trusted implicitly, a person woven into the fabric of your family's history, has been doing something you cannot unsee once you finally see it clearly. There is a particular, disorienting grief that comes with this kind of discovery, distinct from the grief of learning a stranger has hurt someone you love. It carries with it a retroactive rewriting of every memory you have of that person, every birthday party, every holiday dinner, every ordinary afternoon, suddenly recontextualized, examined for signs you missed, moments where the person's true nature might have been visible, if only you'd been looking for it. I found myself, in the days that followed, unable to stop replaying old memories through this new, painful lens. A photograph on our mantle of Curtis holding Megan as a toddler, taken at some forgotten family barbecue, suddenly felt like it belonged to a different, more sinister story than the one I had always believed it told. A voicemail Curtis had left years earlier, congratulating Megan on her high school graduation, that I had saved on my old phone for no particular reason beyond sentimentality, became something I deleted almost violently, unable to stand the sound of his voice speaking her name, with what I now understood might have already been the beginnings of something predatory, even if neither of us had any way of knowing it at the time. Diane described a similar experience and inability to stop cataloging the past, searching it for warning signs, alternating between relief that she had eventually trusted her instincts and guilt that she hadn't trusted them sooner, hadn't pushed harder in those early weeks when her discomfort was still forming, still inarticulate, still easy for both of us to talk ourselves out of. I did not sleep that night. I lay awake beside Diane, who was similarly awake, both of us staring at the ceiling in the dark, running through years of memories of Curtis, searching for earlier warning signs, finding, uncomfortably, a few small moments that took on new and troubling significance in retrospect comments he'd made about Megan's appearance, even when she was younger, a habit of standing slightly too close that we had always dismissed as simple awkwardness. "What do we do?" Diane asked me, somewhere around 2 in the morning. "Frank is your family. Ruth has been like a grandmother to Megan her whole life. If we do this the way it needs to be done, we lose all of that." "We already lost it," I said. "The moment he put his hand on our daughter's arm in that stockroom, we lost whatever that relationship used to be. The only question now is what we do to protect Megan going forward." I did not sleep, and by morning I had made a decision I did not discuss with Diane beforehand, because I think some part of me knew she would try to talk me into a more measured approach than the one I was determined to take. I drove to Curtis's house before 8 in the morning, before he would have left for work, and I knocked on his door with a controlled intensity that I know, in retrospect, must have been visible on my face even before he opened it. Curtis looked genuinely surprised to see me, and for a brief, absurd moment, some habitual politeness in me nearly asked how he was doing, before I remembered why I was standing on his porch. "We need to talk," I said, "about what happened at the bookstore last night." I watched his face move through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, then something that looked almost like calculation, and finally a kind of defensive irritation that told me everything I needed to know about whether he intended to take responsibility for what he'd done. "It wasn't like she's probably making it sound," he said. "I just stopped by to check on her. We talked. That's it." "She told us you put your hand on her arm and wouldn't let her past you," I said, keeping my voice as level as I could manage, though I could feel my hands shaking at my sides. "She told us about the comments you've been making for months, about her uniform, about needing someone older. Do you want to keep telling me it's nothing, Curtis? Because I am asking you right now, man to man, to tell me the truth." There was a long silence on that porch, longer than I think either of us was comfortable with, and in it I watched something shift in Curtis's expression, the defensiveness giving way, briefly, to something that might have been shame, though I have never been fully certain, in the time since, whether it was genuine remorse or simply the recognition that he had been caught. "I don't know what's wrong with me," he said finally, and his voice had dropped to something quieter, something that almost sounded like the cousin I had grown up with, rather than the man who had cornered my daughter in a stockroom. "My marriage is falling apart. I've felt invisible for years. Megan is she's kind, and she listens, and I know how that sounds. I know it's wrong, but I convinced myself it was harmless, that it was just talk." "It wasn't just talk," I said. "You put your hands on her. You cornered her in a room she couldn't easily leave. That is not harmless, Curtis. That is exactly the kind of thing that destroys a person's sense of safety in the world. And you did it to a girl who has called you her uncle since she was born." Curtis did not respond immediately, and in the silence that followed, I found myself studying his face with an intensity I had never before directed at him, searching for something, some sign of the man I thought I had known, or perhaps some sign of whoever this new, unrecognizable version of him actually was. "What do you want me to do?" he finally asked, and there was something in the question that struck me as almost pathetic. A man looking for someone else to hand him a solution, rather than taking ownership of the harm he'd caused. "I want you to understand that this isn't something I'm going to let slide, because we're family," I told him. "I want you to stay away from her completely, starting today. No visits, no calls, no showing up at her work under any circumstance whatsoever. And I want you to understand that depending on what Megan decides she needs, this may not end with just a conversation between the two of us." "You're going to call the police?" "Over this?" Curtis said, and for the first time in our conversation, something sharper entered his voice, something closer to the defensiveness he'd shown at the start. "I didn't hurt her, Robert. I made a mistake. I said some things I shouldn't have said. That doesn't make me a criminal." "You put your hand on her arm and blocked her path to the door when she tried to leave," I said, keeping my own voice as level as I could manage, despite the anger building in my chest. "In what world is that not something a woman has the right to report? You don't get to decide, on her behalf, how serious what you did was. That decision belongs to her and to Diane and to me, not to you." I left his porch that morning without any resolution beyond the clear, unmistakable message that our family would not be minimizing what he had done, and I remember driving home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, replaying the conversation, wondering if I had said enough, wondering if there had been some better way to make him understand the full weight of what he'd done, wondering, too, whether any conversation could have accomplished that, given how thoroughly he still seemed to be minimizing his own actions, even while nominally admitting to them. The days that followed the confrontation were among the most difficult our extended family has ever navigated, and I do not think there was any way to make them painless, no matter how carefully Diane and I tried to handle the situation. We told Frank and Ruth together, sitting in their living room on a Sunday afternoon, in a conversation I had dreaded more than almost any other conversation of my adult life. Frank's initial reaction was disbelief, then anger not at Curtis, at first, but at us, as though we were the ones introducing a problem into a family that had functioned perfectly well before we raised it. "You're telling me my son, who has known Megan since she was in diapers, tried something with her?" Frank said, his voice rising in a way I had rarely heard from him in 30 years of friendship. "I don't believe it. There has to be some misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding, Frank," I said, as gently as I could manage while still being unmistakably firm. "Megan told us exactly what happened, in detail, and when I confronted Curtis directly, he admitted to it. He didn't deny the stockroom, he didn't deny the comments. He told me himself that he knew it was wrong and he did it anyway." Ruth, to her credit, did not share her husband's initial disbelief. I watched her face change as I spoke, moving through something that looked like horror, then grief, and finally a kind of resigned, exhausted acceptance that told me she had perhaps sensed something was wrong, long before either Diane or I had said a word. "He's been different since the divorce started," she said quietly, more to herself than to any of us. "I noticed he was spending more time at your house, but I told myself it was just loneliness. I should have asked more questions. I have thought often, in the time since, about the particular position Ruth found herself in that afternoon, caught between her loyalty to her son and her genuine, evident concern for Megan, a girl she had helped raise in every meaningful sense apart from biology. She did not, in that first conversation, fully break from Frank's defensiveness, but I could see, even then, that some deeper part of her had already accepted the truth of what we were telling her, even if she wasn't yet ready to say so out loud in front of her husband. Frank did not come around easily, and I understand, even now, that some part of that resistance was not really about disbelieving Megan's account, but about the impossible weight of accepting that his own son had done something this serious. It took nearly 2 weeks, and a difficult, painful conversation directly between Frank and Curtis, before Frank finally accepted the full truth of what had happened, and began, however reluctantly, to hold his son accountable, rather than making excuses on his behalf. I learned, much later, some of the details of that conversation between Frank and his son, pieced together from things Ruth eventually shared with Diane during one of their more honest conversations in the months that followed. Frank had apparently confronted Curtis directly, demanding to know whether the accusations were true, and Curtis, rather than continuing to deny everything as he had with me on his porch, had broken down entirely, admitting not only to the stockroom incident, but to months of what he himself, in a rare moment of honesty, described as letting myself think about her in ways I had no right to think about her. Frank told Ruth afterward that it was one of the most painful conversations of his life, not because he doubted the truth any longer, but because he could no longer avoid the reality that the son he had raised, the boy he had once been unreservedly proud of, had become someone capable of this. "I keep asking myself where I failed him," Frank admitted to me once, months later, during one of the rare, careful conversations we still occasionally had, whether there was some moment, some lesson I should have taught him more clearly, that would have stopped this from happening. I don't have an answer. I don't think there is a clean answer. Some people make choices that have nothing to do with how they were raised, and I think I have to live with not fully understanding why my son made this one. I found myself, in those first weeks after telling Frank and Ruth, thinking often about the particular cruelty of a situation like this one, the way it forces good, decent people who genuinely love their child to reckon with the reality that the child they raised has become capable of serious harm, all while simultaneously demanding that those same people prioritize the safety and well-being of the person their child hurt. I do not think there is any way to navigate that reckoning painlessly, and I came, eventually, to feel a complicated mixture of anger and genuine sympathy toward Frank and Ruth. Both anger that Frank's first instinct had been disbelief, rather than concern for Megan, sympathy for the impossible position both of them found themselves in, through no fault of their own. Ruth, in particular, made a choice in those early weeks that I have come to respect deeply, even though it must have cost her enormously. She began, quietly and without fanfare, checking in with Megan directly, sending occasional texts that simply said things like, "Thinking of you," or "You don't have to respond. I just want you to know, I believe you." Small gestures that Megan told us meant more to her than perhaps Ruth ever fully understood. Ruth never asked Megan to reconcile with Curtis, never suggested that family loyalty required forgiveness on any particular timeline, never once put Megan in the position of managing anyone else's feelings about the situation. She simply, consistently, made clear that her love for Megan had not been contingent on her son's behavior, and that this love would remain steady regardless of how the rest of the situation unfolded between our families. The weeks between our confrontation with Curtis and the actual filing of the police report were, in some ways, harder on our family than the confrontation itself, because they were filled with a kind of suspended tension that none of us knew how to fully live inside. Megan continued going to work, though we had insisted, and she had agreed without much argument, that she would no longer close the store alone, a small practical adjustment that nonetheless served as a constant, visible reminder of what had happened. I remember one evening in particular, roughly 10 days after the stockroom incident, when I found Megan sitting alone on our back porch well after dark, staring out at nothing in particular, and I sat down beside her without saying anything for a long while, because I had learned, in those difficult weeks, that Megan needed space to speak in her own time, rather than being pushed toward conversation before she was ready. "I keep replaying it," she finally said. "Not just what happened, but every conversation before it. Every time he made a comment and I laughed it off instead of saying something. I keep wondering if I made it easier for him, by not shutting it down the first time." "You didn't make anything easier for him," I told her, and I meant it as firmly as I have ever meant anything. "The responsibility for what he did belongs entirely to him. You were being polite to someone you'd trusted your entire life. That's not a failure on your part, Megan. That's exactly what a reasonable person does with family, right up until the moment family stops behaving like family." "I know that logically," she said. "I just don't always feel it." That distinction between knowing something logically and feeling it fully became, I think, the central struggle of Megan's recovery over the months that followed, and it is one I suspect many people who have survived similar experiences will recognize immediately. Understanding, intellectually, that you did nothing wrong does not automatically dissolve the guilt, the self-doubt, the endless replaying of moments that feels, in the aftermath, like searching for the exact instant you could have prevented everything, even when no such instant genuinely exists. Diane and I struggled, during those waiting weeks, with how much normalcy to try to preserve in our household, versus how much to allow the situation to visibly reshape our daily routines. We debated whether to tell Megan's older cousins, whether to mention anything to the neighbors who might notice Curtis's sudden and complete absence from our property, whether Megan should take a leave from work or continue as though nothing significant had changed beyond the new policy of never closing alone. In the end, we let Megan largely guide these decisions herself, trusting that she understood, better than we could from the outside, what pace of return to normal life actually felt survivable to her. She chose, for the most part, to keep as much of her routine intact as she could manage, telling us that the alternative, allowing Curtis's actions to reshape every corner of her life, felt like handing him a kind of victory she refused to grant. I admired this instinct in her deeply, even as Diane and I privately worried, at times, that she was pushing herself back into normalcy faster than was genuinely healthy. Her therapist, once we finally connected her with one, helped us understand that there is no single correct pace for this kind of recovery, and that Megan's instinct to reclaim her routines quickly was neither inherently healthy nor inherently avoidant. It was simply her particular way of processing what had happened, and our job was to support that process rather than second-guess it based on some external idea of how recovery was supposed to look. Diane and I made the decision, together with Megan, to file an official report with the local police department about the stockroom incident, not out of a desire for punishment for its own sake, but because we understood, both of us, that Curtis's behavior represented an escalating pattern, and that without some formal consequence, there was no reason to believe it would stop, whether with Megan or with some other young woman in the future. Megan, to her enormous credit, was the one who ultimately made the final decision to move forward with the report, after several days of us making clear that whatever she chose, we would support her fully. "I don't want to be scared of my own driveway," she told us, sitting at our kitchen table, with a resolve in her voice that filled me with a complicated mixture of pride and grief. Pride at her strength, grief that she had needed to find that strength at all, at 20 years old, because of a man who should have protected her instead of frightening her. The process of actually filing the report was more grueling than any of us anticipated, even having braced ourselves for difficulty. Megan had to recount the stockroom incident in detail to a detective she had never met, a woman named Detective Sarah Palmer who, to her credit, handled the interview with a gentleness and professionalism that made an unbearable process at least somewhat bearable. Megan had to describe, in specific and uncomfortable detail, the exact sequence of what Curtis had said and done, the exact positioning of his body relative to the door, the exact words he had used, details that, when spoken aloud in the sterile setting of a police interview room, seemed to strip away whatever protective distance Megan had managed to construct around the memory in the weeks since it happened. I felt like I was reliving it while also being cross-examined about whether I was remembering it correctly, Megan told us afterward, exhausted in a way that went beyond simple physical tiredness. "I understand why they need that level of detail. I just wasn't prepared for how much it would hurt to give it to them." Detective Palmer explained to us, in a separate conversation, that the legal threshold for the more serious charges we had initially hoped for Charges that would have reflected the true severity of what Megan experienced required either physical injury or a documented pattern of prior offenses, neither of which applied cleanly to Curtis's case despite the clear and troubling nature of his behavior. It was, Detective Palmer acknowledged with evident frustration of her own, one of the more common and difficult gaps in how the legal system handles cases like Megan's situations that fall short of the law's narrow definitions of the most serious offenses, while still representing genuine, lasting harm to the victim. The legal process that followed was slower and more grinding than any of us anticipated. Because the stockroom incident, while deeply frightening, had not escalated to physical violence in the way the law typically requires for the most serious charges, Curtis was ultimately charged with a lesser offense, unlawful restraint and harassment, rather than anything more severe. It was not, if I am honest, the outcome any of us felt fully satisfied by. But it was enough to create a permanent legal record, enough to result in a restraining order that legally prohibited Curtis from coming within a certain distance of Megan, and enough, crucially, to force Frank and Ruth to finally, fully reckon with what their son had done, rather than continuing to minimize it as a misunderstanding. We attended the court hearing together as a family, Diane and I flanking Megan in the gallery, watching Curtis stand before a judge in a suit that looked unfamiliar on him, a man I had known my entire life, suddenly reduced to a defendant, reciting careful, lawyer-approved answers to a series of procedural questions. I remember feeling almost nothing during that hearing beyond a strange, hollow exhaustion, none of the anger I had expected, none of the satisfaction I had half hoped might come with seeing some measure of formal accountability finally applied. Just a tired, worn-down relief that the process, at least, was reaching some kind of conclusion, even if the conclusion felt smaller than the harm it was meant to address. Curtis's marriage, already fragile before any of this began, did not survive the fallout. His wife, upon learning the full details during the legal proceedings, filed for divorce within the month, and I understand, through the fragments of information that still occasionally reach us through Frank and Ruth, that Curtis eventually moved to a different state entirely, in what I suspect was as much an attempt to escape the reputation he'd built in our small community as anything else. I have told most of this story from my own perspective, as I think is natural given that I am the one recounting it, but I would be leaving out something essential if I didn't dedicate space specifically to what this ordeal cost Diane, and how differently she carried it compared to how I carried it myself. Diane has told me, in the time since, that she experienced a particular, compounding guilt throughout this entire process that I don't think I ever fully understood until she articulated it directly to me, late one night, nearly a year after the stockroom incident. "I noticed something was wrong before either of you did," she said. "I told you my instincts were telling me something, and you talked me out of taking it seriously, and I let you talk me out of it, even though some part of me knew I shouldn't. I carry that. I carry the weeks between when I first noticed and when Megan finally told us what was happening, wondering what might have been prevented if I'd pushed harder, sooner. I want to say clearly, for the record, that I do not believe Diane bears any responsibility for what Curtis did, and I have told her this many times, in as many ways as I can find to say it. The responsibility for his actions belongs entirely to him. But I understand, too, that logic does not always reach the places where guilt actually lives. And Diane's guilt, however unwarranted, was real and heavy, and something she had to work through in her own time, largely through months of her own individual therapy that ran alongside the family counseling we eventually pursued together. Diane also carried, throughout that year, the particular burden of maintaining her friendship with Ruth, even while feeling, understandably, a significant anger toward the family that had produced and, in Frank's case initially, defended the man who had harmed her daughter. She described it to me once as trying to hold two entirely true things in her hands at the same time, without letting either one crush the other. The genuine decades-deep affection she felt for Ruth as a person and a friend, and the genuine righteous anger she felt toward the situation Ruth's son had created. I do not know that I could have managed that particular balancing act with as much grace as Diane did. There were moments, she has admitted, when she nearly let the friendship go entirely, when the anger felt too large to hold alongside anything gentler. That she found a way to keep both things true, without pretending either one away, is something I have come to admire about her more with each passing year of our marriage. Our own relationship, too, went through a difficult stretch during that first year. One I haven't mentioned yet because it felt, for a long time, too private and too painful to include even in a story I've otherwise tried to tell honestly. Diane and I disagreed, at various points, about how aggressively to pursue the legal process, about how much contact, if any, to maintain with the Coopers during the most difficult months, about how to balance protecting Megan's privacy with our own need to process what had happened by talking to trusted friends outside the immediate family. These disagreements were never about whether to support Megan, we were unified on that from the very first night, but about the countless smaller decisions that make up the actual granular work of navigating a family crisis. Decisions that don't come with a clear right answer, and that two exhausted, frightened parents will not always agree on in the moment. We got through it, in the end, largely by committing to a rule we adopted about 2 months in, after a particularly difficult argument that neither of us handled well, that we would not make any significant decision about how to handle the situation without both of us fully agreeing first, even if that meant slowing things down, even if that meant sitting with discomfort a little longer than either of us wanted to. It was not a perfect system, but it kept us from making decisions out of anger or exhaustion that we might have later regretted, and it forced us to keep talking to each other, even during the weeks when talking felt like the last thing either of us had energy for. I have not yet spoken about how the wider circle of our neighborhood and extended community responded once the situation with Curtis became more widely known, and I think it's worth including, because it added a layer of complexity to an already difficult year that none of us fully anticipated. Larkspur Avenue is not a large street, and the Coopers and the Hales had been fixtures of it for over 3 decades between us. Word travels quickly in a community like ours, and within a few months of the police report being filed, it had become, in the careful, euphemistic way small communities discuss uncomfortable things, common knowledge that something happened between Curtis and our daughter. The reactions were more varied than I expected. Some neighbors were immediately and unreservedly supportive, people I had known for years who made a point of stopping by, or calling, or simply catching my eye at the mailbox with an expression that communicated solidarity, without requiring either of us to say anything explicit about the situation. Our neighbor 2 doors down, Carol Jensen, who had watched Megan grow up alongside her own daughter, showed up on our porch one evening with a casserole and sat with Diane for 2 hours, mostly listening, occasionally sharing her own decades-old story of a similar experience with a family friend that she had never told anyone before, a story that had clearly been waiting, unspoken, for the right moment to finally be shared. But there were other reactions that were harder to absorb. A handful of people in the neighborhood, longtime friends of Frank's in particular, seemed to view the entire situation through a lens of divided loyalty, treating it less as a matter of Megan's safety and more as an awkward social rupture that had inconvenienced everyone's previously comfortable social arrangements. I remember one particularly painful conversation with a man named Gerald, who had golfed with Frank for over 20 years, who suggested to me, with what he seemed to genuinely believe was helpful perspective, that these things get blown out of proportion sometimes, and that perhaps, given how close our families had always been, some kind of quieter resolution might have been more appropriate than involving the police. I did not handle that conversation with as much grace as I would have liked. I told Gerald, more sharply than I typically speak to anyone, that there was no version of quieter resolution that involved my daughter continuing to feel unsafe in her own workplace, and that I found it telling that his instinct, upon learning a young woman had been cornered and harassed, was to worry about the social comfort of the people around her rather than her actual well-being. Gerald and I have not spoken much since, and I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that I do not particularly miss the friendship. What I learned from these varied reactions, across that difficult year, is something I suspect many families who go through similar experiences eventually learn, that a crisis like this one reveals, with unusual clarity, exactly who in your life is capable of prioritizing a victim's safety over their own comfort, and who is not. It is not always the people you would have predicted beforehand. Some relationships I expected to survive the strain did not. Some I never would have anticipated deepening did exactly that. I asked Megan, while preparing to tell this story, whether there was anything she wanted included that I might not think to say myself, speaking as her father rather than as the person who actually lived through what happened. She thought about it for a long while before answering, and what she eventually told me felt important enough that I want to include it here as close to her own words as I can manage. I think people who haven't been through something like this imagine it's mostly about the scary moment itself, she said. The stockroom, the hand on my arm, all of that. And that moment was terrifying, don't get me wrong. But honestly, the harder part was everything after the months of feeling like I had to justify my own reaction. the exhaustion of telling the story over and over to detectives and lawyers. The weird guilt of watching my grandparents in all but blood grieve their own son while I was still trying to process what he did to me. Nobody really prepares you for how long the aftermath lasts, or how much of it has nothing to do with the original scary moment at all. She also wanted me to include something about what helped her, in case anyone listening to this story finds themselves in a similar position and is looking for some sense of what recovery can actually look like. Therapy helped enormously, she said. I was resistant to it at first, because I think I had some idea that going to therapy meant admitting I was permanently broken by what happened, and I didn't want to believe that about myself. But my therapist helped me understand that processing something difficult isn't the same as being broken by it. It's actually the opposite. It's how you make sure it doesn't quietly control you for the rest of your life without your permission. The other thing that helped, she added, honestly, was my parents believing me immediately and completely from the very first conversation. I know not everyone gets that. I've talked to other people since who went through something similar and had family members who doubted them, or minimized it, or made them feel like they were the problem for speaking up. I think that's almost a second trauma, on top of the first one. I got lucky that my mom and dad never once made me doubt whether my own reaction was justified. I don't think I could have gotten through the legal process, or through everything with the Coopers, without that foundation underneath me. I include this not to congratulate myself. As a father, I made plenty of mistakes in the early days of this ordeal, moments of denial and slow understanding that I am not proud of, but because I think Megan's point about immediate belief is one of the most important lessons this entire experience taught our family, and one I hope reaches anyone listening to this story who might someday find themselves on the receiving end of a similar disclosure from someone they love. I also asked Megan whether she had any advice specifically for other young women who might find themselves in a similar situation, uncertain whether a trusted family friend's behavior has crossed a line, or whether they're overreacting to something more innocent than it feels. Her answer was direct and, I think, worth including exactly as she gave it. Trust the discomfort, she said. I spent months making excuses for how he was acting, telling myself I was being paranoid, telling myself that surely a man who'd known me my whole life wouldn't actually do anything wrong. That instinct to explain away discomfort, to give the benefit of the doubt over and over, almost cost me more than it did. The moment something makes you feel uneasy, even if you can't fully explain why, that feeling is information. It doesn't mean you have to blow up your life immediately, but it does mean you should take it seriously. Tell someone you trust, and stop assuming the burden is on you to prove something bad is actually happening before you're allowed to protect yourself. She also wanted to speak directly to the guilt she knows other survivors often carry about family relationships damaged by their disclosure. I used to feel like I was the one who broke everything, she told me. Like if I just stayed quiet, the Coopers would still be exactly what they always were to us. But that's backwards. Curtis broke it, the moment he decided his own desires mattered more than my safety or our family's trust. I didn't break anything by telling the truth. I just made visible something that was already broken. I will not pretend that the relationship between our family and the Coopers ever fully recovered, because it did not, and I think pretending otherwise would dishonor how genuinely difficult this experience was for everyone involved, including Frank and Ruth, who lost a version of their family they had believed in as completely as we had. But something did survive, in a diminished, more careful form. Ruth still calls Diane occasionally, and the two of them have found a way to maintain a friendship that exists somewhat apart from what happened, built on decades of history that neither of them wanted to discard entirely, even while both of them understood that things could never return to exactly what they were before. Frank and I speak less often than we once did, and when we do, there is a carefulness between us that wasn't there before, a shared understanding that we are both still, in our own ways, grieving something that broke and cannot be fully repaired. Megan, for her part, has done remarkably well in the 2 years since. She finished her degree, moved into her own apartment across town, and has, by every measure I can see as her father, built a life that feels genuinely her own, unburdened by the shadow of what happened in that stockroom. She still, occasionally, brings it up in conversation, not with the raw pain of those first difficult weeks, but with a kind of hard-won clarity, the perspective of someone who survived something frightening and came out the other side more certain of her own strength than she had been before. I used to think being polite meant not making a scene, she told me once, not long ago, over dinner at a restaurant near her new apartment. I used to think if someone made me uncomfortable, the right thing to do was smile through it, so I didn't embarrass anyone. What happened with Curtis taught me That's exactly backward. The scene isn't the problem. Staying quiet to protect someone who's hurting you, that's the problem. I think about that conversation often, because I believe it captures something important about how this entire ordeal, painful as it was, ultimately changed our family for the better, even as it cost us a relationship we had valued for 30 years. Megan learned, at 20, a lesson that took me considerably longer in my own life to fully understand, that protecting the people you love sometimes requires being willing to lose relationships you never imagined losing, and that no history, no shared childhood, no decades of trust obligates you to remain silent in the face of someone crossing a line that should never have been crossed. I have thought, often, about what I would say to another father who found himself standing where I once stood in the position of learning, suddenly and without warning, that someone trusted deeply within his family's circle had crossed a line with his daughter. I do not think I have any perfect wisdom to offer, but I have learned some things through this experience that I believe are worth passing along, and I want to include them here, even though they interrupt the narrative flow of the story, because I suspect some portion of anyone listening to this may need to hear them directly. The first thing I would say is this: believe your daughter immediately, completely, and without requiring her to convince you. I did not do this perfectly in the earliest days, and I regret every hour I spent looking for alternative explanations rather than simply accepting what Megan told me at face value. The instinct to protect a long-standing relationship, to find some innocent reading of ambiguous behavior, is powerful and, I now understand, deeply counterproductive. Your daughter does not benefit from your search for reasonable doubt on behalf of someone who has made her feel unsafe. She benefits from your immediate, unwavering support. The second thing I would say is that you cannot control how your extended family responds, and you should not delay protecting your child while waiting for consensus or understanding from people who may never fully arrive at it. Frank's initial defensiveness was painful, but I did not wait for his approval before confronting Curtis directly, and I would not have waited even if Frank had never come around at all. Protecting your child cannot be contingent on maintaining everyone else's comfort. The third thing, and perhaps the hardest, is that the legal system will often disappoint you, particularly in cases that fall short of physical violence, but still represent genuine, serious harm. I went into the legal process with expectations that were, in hindsight, somewhat naive, and I had to make peace with an outcome that felt smaller than the crime it was meant to address. I do not say this to discourage anyone from pursuing legal recourse. The restraining order and the formal record mattered, and I believe pursuing them was the right choice. But I say it so that other families going through something similar can enter that process with realistic expectations, rather than the kind of disappointment that compounds an already difficult experience. And the fourth thing I would say, finally, is that recovery is not a single event, but an ongoing practice, for the victim and for the entire family around her. There was no single day when Megan was suddenly better, no single moment when Diane and I stopped feeling the aftershocks of what had happened. There was, instead, a slow, uneven accumulation of good days outnumbering bad ones, of old comfort gradually replaced by new, hard-won confidence, of a family finding its footing again on ground that had genuinely shifted beneath us. There is a fifth thing, too, that I hesitated to include for a long time because it felt uncomfortably close to self-criticism, but I think it belongs here regardless. I would tell other fathers not to underestimate how much their own reaction, in those first critical hours and days, shapes how their daughter processes what happened to her. I have thought often about how differently things might have unfolded if I had responded to Megan's initial, tentative complaint about Curtis's behavior with the same seriousness I eventually brought to the stockroom incident. Instead, my early instinct to minimize, to find innocent explanations, likely taught Megan, however unintentionally, that her discomfort alone wasn't sufficient grounds for concern, that something worse needed to happen before her feelings would be taken fully seriously. I do not think I can undo that early failure, but I can name it honestly, in the hope that another father reading or listening to this account might recognize the same instinct rising in himself and choose, this time, to override it before real harm occurs. As I finish telling this story, it has been just over 2 years since that Thursday evening when Megan came home from the bookstore with her hands shaking. Life has, in the particular, resilient way that life tends to do, found a new normal, not the same normal we had before, but a genuine, functioning stability that none of us could have predicted in those first raw weeks. Megan recently celebrated her 22nd birthday, and I watched her at the small gathering we held at our house, laughing easily with a group of friends she's made since starting her new job at a marketing firm downtown, and I found myself struck by how completely she has reclaimed the parts of herself that I worried, in the darkest early days of this ordeal, might have been permanently taken from her. She is dating someone now, a kind, patient man named Ethan, whom she introduced to us cautiously, almost apologetically, as though she needed our explicit reassurance that it was acceptable for her to trust someone new after everything that had happened. Diane cried the first time Megan brought him to dinner, not out of sadness, but out of a relief so overwhelming it needed somewhere to go. Frank and Ruth still live next door. We are not what we once were to each other, but we are also not strangers, and there is something in the fact that 30 years of genuine history did not simply evaporate, even under the weight of what happened, that I have come to find quietly meaningful, even if it is not the resolution any of us would have chosen if we'd had a choice. Ruth waves to Diane most mornings. Frank and I nod to each other over the shared fence, exchanging the kind of brief, careful pleasantries that acknowledge, without needing to say so directly, everything that still sits unresolved between our two families. Curtis, as far as I know, has not returned to our community, and I have made my peace, mostly, with never fully understanding what led him to become someone capable of what he did to Megan. I do not think that understanding, even if I could somehow access it, would change anything meaningful about how our family has healed. Some questions, I have learned, simply do not have answers worth pursuing. What matters in the end is not why Curtis crossed the line he crossed, but the fact that our family imperfectly, painfully, but completely refused to let his crossing define what came after it. I think, often, about the version of my life where I never sat down beside Megan on that back porch, where I continued explaining away her discomfort rather than eventually confronting it directly, where the stockroom incident happened not as a turning point, but simply as one more thing to be minimized and absorbed into an increasingly dangerous status quo. I do not know how that version of our story would have ended, and I am grateful, more than I can adequately express, that I never had to find out. What I know instead is this, that a 30-year friendship, however painful its unraveling, was never worth more than my daughter's safety. That trust, even trust built over decades and reinforced by 1,000 ordinary, affectionate memories, can still be betrayed, and that the betrayal does not become less real simply because the person responsible for it once taught you to fish, or held you as a baby, or sat beside you at every holiday dinner of your childhood. Family, in the truest sense of the word, is not simply a matter of history or blood or long familiarity. It is a matter of who continues to earn your trust every single day, and who, when finally tested, chooses to honor it rather than betray it. Megan taught me that lesson, at 20 years old, with more clarity and courage than I managed to find in myself, until she forced me to see it. I will be grateful to her, and proud of her, for the rest of my life,